Welcome to my new engine devlog video. This week is week number 3, and I was quite content with what I achieved during this week. So for example, last week I was talking about Z clipping, or this near Z plane clipping, and it didn't really work well last week. I had some issues, and I had about 130 lines of code, and somehow I managed to to completely remove these 130 lines of code with one additional if statement within the rendering loop, and this was quite surprising that this was possible. I mean, my Z buffer is an unsigned integer with 32 bits, which is quite big. As far as I know, graphics cards use 24 bits for Z buffering, but I have 32, and I use 31 of them. And yeah, and if something goes beyond the Z buffer, if something moves behind the near clipping plane, or behind the furious camera plane, then there's some kind of integer overflow, and suddenly the number gets extremely big, and so I simply can check if the Z buffering value is beyond signed integer 32 max. So I leave this one bit open, and yeah, and then suddenly my clipping works perfectly for the near and far clipping plane. And yeah, this was quite surprising, but it works pretty well. And yeah, and what else did I do? I implemented some scaling, which was not a very big thing to do. I just had to add some functionality to my object 3D class. I simply had to add, no, not to add, I had to multiply the vertices positions in my vertex shader of the renderer, and voila, everything was done with scaling. And I was working on setting up the engine. I mean, when you were starting the engine in your program, or currently in my program, because I'm the only one using it right now, then I have the possibility to set some parameters now. For example, I don't have to recompile the whole engine just because I want to change its resolution. I can do this now in my program, and I don't have to wait to compile my engine for 20 seconds anymore. Yeah, and I can set full screen mode on or off. This is quite helpful, and if the user doesn't set any values, then the engine resorts to some basic or some standard values. So this is pretty fine, and I was working on setting up primitives. I mean, you can see right now there's some box rotating in front of us. So with this whole primitive thing, I wanted to show you something else than just what is my engine showing right now. I mean, I wanted to show some different stages of creating these primitives. So with my primitives, here you can see my quad, which is basically just 2 triangles covered with the texture. So it's nothing fancy. I mean, I don't have too many primitives right now, but I figured out that a quad might be pretty much essential because of a lot of effects, and I want to downscale models or meshes, and if I downscale them enough, they might just be rendered onto a quad. So there's hopefully not much calculation necessary during runtime to show them. This is part of my engine being able to run on pretty old hardware as well. Although rendering a quad is not that easy within a software renderer. I mean, technically it's not hard, but it still needs a lot of computing power for not showing actually too much. So maybe I use some SDL blitting function in the future, but who knows. For now, this is a regular quad. It's covered with the texture, and it's rendered within 3D space, so it has regular transformations applicable, like rotations, translations. Here we are with my cube. I mean, basically it's the same cube like in this current engine state, which I showed earlier and will show later again. But I recorded this GIF, or this GIF, however you want to call it, and yeah, and I wanted to show you the quad primitive, not the quad, the cube primitive. I mean, obviously it's a cube that's also textured, but maybe you can see that the texture is doing weird stuff while the cube is rotating. This is due to the non-perspective correct texture mapping. It's a little bit hard to describe how it works. I mean, yeah, if you have these vertices that make up one face of the cube, they get transformed because of the perspective projection matrix. So they change their 3D positions or their 2D positions when they are getting rendered based on their position in 3D space. And since I didn't do the same transformation with the texture coordinates, the texture coordinates were just interpolated in 2D space, but difference in 3D space wasn't accounted for. So you see a little bit weird effects going on with 2D textures on perspective transformated 3D objects. So you see the textures moving up and down depending on the angle. And sadly with this cube it's not too obvious. I mean, you can still see that something is going on and that something is being weird there. But with my box, which I showed earlier, with this crate texture, the effect was much more obvious, and it looked pretty wobbly, but it was pretty lovely in a way. But in the end, if you can avoid such features, you probably want to go for perspective corrected texture mapping, since it looks way more realistic and yeah, in most ways probably more decent. But if you need some more computational power for your software renderer, this is a way where you can save some power, especially old engines like I'm not sure how it was called back then. Was it called Tech1? Yeah, at least the Quake engine back in the days didn't do this perspective corrected texture mapping because of the restraints of the hardware back then. The last feature which I wanted to talk about, which I implemented this week, which is a pretty important feature, but probably not the first thing that people think of during engine development, is texture. Not texture, text. And maybe you have seen on the screen this green little text down on the below on the right side of the picture. This is rendered onto the surface, which I'm rendering to. So first there's this whole 3D rendering thing going on, and afterwards the text is rendered onto the pre-rendered Windows surface. And currently the text rendering is quite simple. I mean, I use SDL TTF for text rendering, so I can read at least 2 different kinds of fonts, TTF fonts, and I'm not sure how the other one is called. I think FOT or FON, I'm not sure, but I assume they're not too important, at least anymore. So so I can now render TTF fonts, and since my text interface is pretty limited so far, and I'm still only working on this 2D interface for my software renderer, I can only place text on the screen in absolute terms, and I still can't delete the text if it's rendered onto the screen. So with one command, or with one line, you can add text, but then it gets rendered each frame. But this deleting of the current texts on the screen is not a big issue, or not a lot of work to do. I simply couldn't do it up to this point because I did a lot of other things, and and as I said in the beginning of the video, I'm quite content with what I achieved during this week. And if you have thoughts, let me know in the comments, or as always, if you're interested in engine development, you might want to participate. And as always, the link to the GitHub repository is down below, and I hope you have a nice week, and see you next week. Bye.